Thank you, Miriam. Harvest is a funny thing for city folk, isn't it? It's a strange festival. It can feel a bit sort of sentimental, a bit like a yearning for a past age in which there was a connection between the community and the soil, between what we did and what we ate. It can feel almost like a sort of yearning for the bucolic, a desire perhaps to up sticks and live in the country. And certainly during COVID, many people have experimented with that dream, haven't they, with moving out of the city and taking flight to the countryside, finding a place of beauty in which to dwell. Although life doesn't change that much, what you have to have is a high-speed internet connection if you're going to do that, and a form of employment that allows you to connect remotely. But nonetheless, we're aware, aren't we, that at some point in most of us, there's a bit of a yearning for the country, for the world, for the agricultural. And for some, harvest is a sort of point of focus for that yearning, a point of connection, perhaps, with a world that we've largely lost touch with. I've never watched it, although I understand it's enormously popular. There's been this great sort of hit on Amazon Prime in the last year or so, Clarkson's Farm. I don't know if any of you have seen it. And someone wrote in the papers a couple of weeks ago that show had done more for farmers than the NFU had done in decades, just in bringing the real world of farming to people's attention. Now, I don't know whether that's true, whether that's fair to the National Farmers Union or not. But there's that sort of sense that people have found a way to connect with agriculture through that show. But the big thing is that actually we've lost that connection, haven't we? There's a disconnect between the land and the shelf. We see food as a commodity to be purchased. We expect it to be available whenever we want. We feel pretty put out at the moment that some of the shelves in the supermarket are empty. We can still get pretty much everything we want, but perhaps not in the first shop we go into, or perhaps not exactly the brand that we were hoping for. But nonetheless, we're beginning to have, as a culture here in the UK, we're beginning to have cause to reflect on the connection between the food on our plates and the wider world that we live in and the way that we live. Now, Psalm 65 makes that sort of sense of disconnect all the more acute when you look at the way it's structured. You've got a copy of it in front of you on the bit of paper you were given as you came in. And you see that first paragraph is all about praise and worship and forgiveness. Praise awaits you, our God, in Zion. To you, our vows will be fulfilled. You who answer prayer, to you all people will come. When we were overwhelmed by sin, you forgave our transgressions. That connection of worship and mercy and forgiveness. Then in the rest of the psalm, it's all about this bounteous and bountiful harvest. Blessed are those you choose and bring near to live in your courts. We are filled with the good things of your house. In the mind of David, the great king in Jerusalem, the psalmist here, there's a connection between our relationship with God and the food on our plates, and the bounteous harvest, and the joy of these good things that the earth produces. You crown the year with your bounty, he says, and your carts overflow with abundance. Now, in the Book of Common Prayer, there are services for prayers for rain, prayers for fair weather for the harvest. There's a sort of sense that the church comes together to seek God's mercy in providing for us from the soil, this sort of sense of the whole circle of life being connected with worship. But since the Industrial Revolution, since, I suppose, the things that made Birmingham into a great city in the 19th century, that connection, that sense of all of life as one whole thing has been severed and damaged. So when there are shortages on the shelf of the supermarket, do we instantly think, we need to repent, we need to seek God's mercy, we don't have what we need? No, of course we don't. We think, oh, Brexit. Or supply chains. Or the Suez Canal's been blocked. Or whatever it might be. But there's plenty in the world around us to make us think that the way that we have come to live perhaps isn't quite as stable, as secure, as strong as perhaps we'd come to think of it as being. You see, since the Industrial Revolution, increasingly human beings, particularly in the industrialized West, but not only here, have come to see the world as something that we make and shape for ourselves. We're in control. Agriculture, production, everything is something that in the end is under our power. When was the last time you worried about a bad harvest? I can't think of any time in my lifetime when I have. And yet, events of the last couple of years have at least, I think, started to cause us to question this idea of a world that we make for ourselves, a place where we're in complete control. We've been able, because of what seemed like incredibly robust supply chains, to move to what's called just-in-time delivery, where every industry just receives what it needs just at the moment when it needs it for its processes, so that it doesn't have to waste time and space storing material. It comes in as raw materials, it goes out, processed in the way that is needed, and there is no waste in the system, a bit like the sort of shakes that Charlie's friend got into. But the blocking of the Suez Canal, COVID, Brexit, all those other things have shown us that actually those supply chains that we have thought of as completely robust are actually fragile. And once you start to shake the system, it falls apart in ways that we can't predict and that we don't understand. But more than that, more than the fact that it doesn't always work for us, is the fact that the world is much bigger and much less controllable than we thought it was. We're beginning, aren't we, to have to come to terms with the prospect of long-term climate change, of the ways in which our attempts to manipulate and control the world perhaps have unintended consequences that we couldn't have imagined, and that actually we're not in control. We have to change what we do, or we're going to face serious trouble. We're not masters of the universe. In fact, we're fragile and vulnerable in a world that is bigger and harder to understand than we ever imagined. Now, Psalm 65, and indeed the whole concept of harvest, offers us a different and better logic. Seeing the whole world as joined up, not as something that is sort of independent and out on its own, but as a creation of God, so that the concept of forgiven sin and blessing and harvest going together is one that actually helps us to make sense of life. This idea of forgiveness of sin and blessing going together, well, it's at the very heart of Christian faith. It's a bold claim, but the Christian contention is that human beings are out of step with the God who made us. That each one of us has turned away from him and away from our neighbours and in on ourselves. to serve ourselves as if we were God, to live as if God wasn't there. And the idea in the Christian faith, the Christian contention, is that God hasn't left it like that, but has stepped in to this broken world, himself suffered the consequences of our broken relationship with the God who made us, with us being out of step with reality. Because in the end, that's what sin is. It's getting out of step with reality. It's losing track of how things really are, living as though I'm God and God is not. And at the heart of the Christian faith is the idea that God has stepped in to offer forgiveness, to remake that relationship, to make whole what is broken, to turn back the right way up what's been overturned, and to shower blessings again on his people. Now, it's vital to see it in those terms, because in one sense, it's a deeply, deeply personal thing, isn't it? My sin, and those of you who know me well have seen ways it works out, my sin is that I've turned in on myself. I've put myself at the center of the universe. And that works itself out in destructive ways in my relationships with those closest to me at times, but it works out in a destructive way in my relationship with the God who made me. Two people can't sit on the throne at the same time, can they? My tendency, my temptation is to sit in God's seat in my life. That's a deeply personal thing. It's an individual thing. I need to be forgiven myself as an individual. I need my relationship with God to be put right. But it's not just a narrow, personal relationship with God, because it also affects my relationships with everyone else. And what God does in the church is he calls together people to relate rightly to him, not just as individuals, but as people connected to each other. That's why we meet. That's why we're taking time, many of us today after the service, to go and share a meal together, to share a bit of our lives together, to share something of God's bounty with each other, to enjoy it, to enjoy each other. That's why we talk about church as being a family. It's people that God has brought together into this right relationship with him and transforming our relationships with each other. Now, I take it that if we really live as though that is true, that's going to make a huge difference to the way that we experience and indeed enjoy life, the way we think about the world around us, the way we think about the creation, not as something that is simply there to be plundered, but something that is given to us in trust by a generous and bountiful God. So we look at the world as a treasure to be guarded, to be shepherded, to be looked after. Not just as something for us to control and from which we can take whatever we want. But I think there's something else, and this is what a harvest service does so brilliantly. If I see myself as being in control, and if we as people see ourselves as being in control of our lives and in control of the world, then the temptation and the tendency is to hoard, is to take what we can get and to guard it jealously. After all, if I don't look out for number one, who's going to? But what if there is a God in heaven? What if there is a God who says, I love you so much that I'm prepared to step into your broken world and give up my own life to restore you to a right relationship with me and with people and with the world that I've made? If there's a God like that who generously gives all good things for our enjoyment, who fills you with good things and fills your heart with joy, how does that change the way you relate to the good things that you have? I think it has to make us more open-handed, doesn't it? If what I have has been given to me by someone I can rely on to keep giving, I'm free to share, to give it away, to pass it on to others. And that's why Harvest Festival services have typically taken the form that they do, which is a mix of thanksgiving and giving. So behind me, you can see around the communion table, already people have bought loads of gifts to pass on to those who are currently without through our partnership with St. Germain's Church in North Edgbaston. Sharing the good things that God has given to us, knowing that there's more where that came from. So shortly in our service, we'll have that opportunity for those who've brought gifts, and I might need to employ some of the younger ones as well to bring forward some of the stuff that's been left on the table at the back as well. We'll be able to bring our gifts forward to acknowledge that we are recipients of God's generosity, and so we can reflect that generosity ourselves. So you see, harvest isn't just a sentimental harking back to the past. A chance to reflect, though, instead, on the fact that God is our maker and our generous provider who loves us. We can treat his world accordingly and each other accordingly, sharing the good things that God has given